So in terms of the implications of the Supreme Court's decision on affirmative action in terms of fair admissions, students for fair admissions versus Harvard versus the University of North Carolina. This decision is understood to be having ended affirmative action in higher education, which has tremendous implications not only for domestic students but also international students. And what that means is certainly Indian international students, but also Indian American students, right? Because not all students are from the same caste, same ethnic group, same background. There's a tremendous diversity there that I think has been homogenized, in terms of lumping everybody into a group called Asians, right? So, what exactly does that mean, right? So, implications there. Number two, actually related in terms of implications, remember what the University of North Carolina did about a week after the decision. They issued a press release saying the University of North Carolina, the co-litigant there, defendant with Harvard, said we are ending the consideration of race in admissions, but also employment. Right? So in other words, they're sending the signal that we're not going to pay attention to race when it comes to employment. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean they won't discriminate? Well, that's a good thing. But does it also mean that they won't look at, do we have a department of English of all white male professors? We don't want to consider black professors from South Carolina or Indian professors from the country of India? What does that mean? Does it mean we look at, we're not looking at the kinds of disciplines, the kinds of specialties, academic specialties that people bring to the table in terms of diversity? The point being here is the implications of this for black people, black undergraduates, is profound. But the implications for America, and I believe the rest of the world, is very significant. Okay? Very significant. And here's why. So in most of the companies in which many of us work, there's an Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. So now what happens when we don't have these offices? What happens when these offices are under siege? What happens when the primary and most prominent beneficiaries of affirmative action, namely white women, what happens when we don't have DEI offices? What happens if you have a university like Brandeis that says, we need to have a conference on caste? Yep. Maybe we don't need to have a conference on caste. Maybe we don't need to have conferences on civil rights. Maybe we don't need to have journals focused on these issues, right? Because we are not particularly concerned about diversity. The point being is to limit the implications of this decision to the four corners of the decision, I think is incredibly short-sighted. This is profound. And how do we know the implications here go way beyond college admissions? Simply look at what the litigants are doing, right? In other words, the organization that brought this lawsuit, virtually within days of the opinion says affirmative action is over for colleges and universities, but we will leave it in place for the service academies, for the military academies, right?
Yeah, yeah.
What did they do? They go after them. Yeah. There's a fund that was set up to invest in black women. We know in the U.S. context, black women are among the most educated, least remunerated people in the United States. Now, if the people who are seeking the most degrees and who are the least paid, if a private company says, or an investment fund says, we want to invest in women who have businesses, but those litigants sued them. So the question I ask is, what about those funds that decide, what, we're underinvesting in these communities, we're underinvesting with these particular investors. We want to see more diverse companies, more diverse fundees. Can you do that? So everybody in this room really needs to be concerned, right? It's not about the black undergraduates at Harvard, right? I have two sons who are both brilliant. They did well, they're doing well, they're not at Harvard. I'm concerned about them, right? Okay. Now, the next part of your question is implications for the rest of the world. I think it's important that this is not a matter of legal consequence for the U.S., but a matter of global political consequence. Why? We know that the same people who fund certain movements in the U.S. fund movements elsewhere, number
Yes.
one. Number two, we know the political consultants that work on campaigns here work elsewhere. We know that the same op-eds that drive policy here drive op-eds, drive policy elsewhere, and vice versa. The
Yeah.
point being here is, while affirmative action may be embedded in the Indian Constitution, I would not think that that is safe and sacrosanct. Okay?
Right.
Last point here is, I'm concerned about something we started with at the beginning, which is a kind of what I call freedom movement fratricide, right? To the degree that we're all learning from one another. We are sharing information about movements. What happens when the seeds of discord are sown, right? So in other words, black students are under the impression somehow Asian students, whatever that means, right? We got, millions and millions of people in Africa, millions and millions of people in Asia, and we somehow lump everybody together, right? I'm not quite sure what that means. But that somehow in our movements, we need to be concerned about one another. We need to be fearful of one another. And I go back to what I said at the beginning. Du Bois envisioned global intersectional movements. I think that's where we need to be in this moment, because we're more vulnerable now, I think, than we've ever been. Not in the sense of having fewer resources, but we're more vulnerable in the sense that those with the most power, the most money, have the best tools to keep us divided.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Should we open the question?
yes, yeah. Just last, I want to add one particular element, and that is the lawsuit which was brought for the anti-affirmative action, which saw the whole grave circumstances panning out. Incidentally and interestingly, one of the organizations which was with them was from the Asian group. That was the main organization, but then the collaboration was with the within the Indian diaspora from the higher caste or the upper caste, so-called, who are against affirmative action in India. And then,
I got to say
Yes.
this. I got to say this.
Yeah.
Because here's something that
Yeah.
I'm not sure everyone appreciates. The reason why we have so many talented students from India at American universities and in this country are the immigration laws that were passed on the backs of American civil rights laws. Literally, America's immigration laws were liberalized such that we opened up immigration to the U.S. to include people not merely from Western Europe.
Yes.
And that happened after America's civil rights laws. So in other words, everybody from Ghana, from Nigeria, from India, from China,
Owes to the civil rights movement. Yes.
owes to the civil rights
Yes.
movement. And so I really want to say, if you or your parents, it's like I once tweeted this about Governor Nikki Haley, who's from my home state of South Carolina. Governor Nikki Haley's father, his first job in the U.S. was at a historically black college and university. Her family came to the U.S. on the liberalized immigration laws that black people opened the doors for. What's the point here? The point here is we all have a stake in this together. And if we are so foolish as to allow other people to pit us against one another, not only are we endangered here, we're endangered around the world.
Yeah.
I had to say that.
Yes, of course. And it's so weird because all the Indian diaspora, which you see in the academic spaces, and literally bringing out the intellectual narrative and every other narrative which you see, and talking about global South, and that how global South, it's important for the global South to have representation and positions in boards and have seats in everywhere else. Going into administration, into political houses, in advocacy, every other space is dominated by the same class and castes which are in India. So when you see the same replication, and when these powers kind of amalgamate together, and that's where then we get these major efforts like the affirmative action or the anti-caste discrimination being totally buried or
And we know,
drowned.
since we're an academic institution, I think can we say this aloud?
Yeah.
We know that when we admit more students who are of so-called lower classes, so-called, that the quality of the institution goes up. Why do we say that? So if we look at Harvard, right, thought to be among the best universities in the U.S., Harvard, 100 years ago, was basically a regional school. You know, it was like a kind of finishing school for, you know, well-to-do boys who went to, you know, certain select schools in New England. Charles Eliot, the longest-serving president of Harvard, said, we need to make Harvard a national university, so we need to reach out all across the country from the South, the West, the Midwest, to make Harvard better. We see this in every realm when you open the doors and you admit more women, you admit more people from more different backgrounds, the quality of the institution gets better. So my argument is the more Dalits, the more so-called untouchables, the more so-called backward classes, the more black people, the more Indian people, the more people from China, Ghana, Nigeria, the more diversity you have, the more excellence you have. You have mediocrity when you have homogeneity.
Yes.
That's fact.
So thank you so much, and I open the house for questions coming in from your side. I would request that let it be a comment if it is very short, and if it's a question, to end it with a question mark. And let's have it, and the house is open.
I'd like to go, but I want to give an opportunity
Yes, perfect.
to our guests.
Yeah.
I'd like to say something.
Just want to come back.
So
to-
kindly, when you ask a question, kindly introduce yourself for the benefit of others, and then have your question. Sir, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm Tudor from Sri Lanka. I just want to come back to your point about changes in immigration policy and how it benefited particular institutions in the US. You know, you had to look at two aspects of it. One is what effect it has on the countries of origin, you know, because from the original countries it's brain drain, you know, they lose their best skills. And the second point I want to address is how would those people actually, you know, those who benefit from those policies look at, you know, like help or developing policies which benefit the disadvantaged.
Yeah.
So I just want to get your feedback on that.
That is such a wise point. And I really want to thank you for that point, because we often talk, and this is certainly in the American context, of diversity contributing to meritocracy. But it is not an even proposition. We essentially steal intellectual capital from around the world. We have an upside down set of incentives, which makes it easier, better, more remunerative for people to come here, come to these institutions, and we frankly don't sow seed in terms of where the intellectual capital comes from. One of the things that, you know, I've often thought about is if we have scholarships for people, from students and scholars to come here, is it inappropriate to talk about scholarships and investment in terms of communities where people come from, right? You know, so in other words, if I offer you as a scholar a certain amount of money to come to the U.S. And to, you know, be on the faculty of my institution, is it inappropriate for your home institution to ask for support, right? Because we see this, you know, certainly globally, we also see it in the U.S., right? In other words, if we look at the South, where many, you know, Black Americans come from, and look at the intellectual capital in the Great Migration, like literally as a consequence of racial terrorism and violence and Jim Crow segregation, many people left the South to go north, where they often live less long, right? Because the economic conditions were quite demanding. But again, no investment. So I think you're 100% on point. Because it's, I mean, you see it at the Kennedy School. When 50% of the class, 50% of the class comes from around the world. A lot of students want to stay, they want to do other things. And we pat ourselves on the back for having the best and brightest, but it came at a cost.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Nish, for organizing the event.
I am Dr. Ramesh.
So we have him, and then we have your question.
I actually
yeah.
deferred my question to
Yeah.
Dr. Tudor. But Professor Brooks, first of all, it's an honor to go up to Brandeis. I've been on the faculty at the Howard School for 12 years. I come from...
So please introduce yourself.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
Rajesh. I'm here at the Heller School, but also Brandeis for 12 years. And, you know, the Harvard decision, the disingenuous nature of the conservative court, to add the insult to injury and to say that Brown v. Board is the platform, desegregation. I'm going to take a contrarian view because I appreciate your ecumenical support for the global diversity and this intersectionality, but you and I know that there is a transversal anti-black aspect of this bill. And pointing the finger at European colonization or supremacy, yeah, that's still the game. That's still the main export. But it exists in the non-Western world itself. To the point where the UN has to create a special convention beyond racism and xenophobia, which all BIPOC face.
Right.
Let's get into the granularity of the case, though. My question is, there's a distinction between, let's say, me and you, growing up as people of color in a white Western majority, compared to international students who, up to adulthood, when the human development in the psyche is pretty much consolidated, trauma is there. But they have the benefit of growing up in the majority of their race, so groups, however that's constructed, compared to us. That you said the pitting against, it's not even what different states can do, because we have no national consideration of this issue. But it is, and not just the precarity, as you said, of now black, new generations of black students and what they face, but it's this color blindness, which critical race theorists will draw attention to, embedded in the discussions about caste. That, and it's not just the Asian American coalition that you would presume are upper caste. I realize that the lower caste would also be subjected, but it's the upper caste who de-racialize the matter and make it about, you know, this colorblind kind of metric for excellence. And to your point, I don't think people know this is well into the question. Harvard put forward the most diverse group of people before the decision came out. First ever women majority, first gen, against the other affirmative action, which is the white legacy and faculty and athletes, et cetera, the donors, the people. But highest percentage of black, Native American, let's not forget Latinx.
That's right.
Those the least represented. And the Asian Americans themselves who say, hey, we've been stuck at 18% because you don't want to know SATs and get some personality scores and racialize this is all racist. That they jumped to 26%. And so they're a majority minority. My question to you, younger millennials, 30, now Gen Z getting older, Alpha coming behind them, Beta will start in 2027. Majority minority already, forget about the older generation, they're gonna disappear at some point. It is majority minority that is structural. Whether I have faith in the social movements or not, or the power to release this energy, and not because of Trump, the courts have been historically consolidated as conservative leaning. This is a chasm. This is an apocalyptic schism by which the younger people are going to be subjected to the draconian thinking. Even on abortion, for example, but certainly on affirmative action. What's your response to the pessimist who says, the prison is just, they've consolidated the prison and made it look, you know, open to diversity?
Right. Well, two things. I think you named the problem well, that the disingenuousness of the Supreme Court decision has baked in a kind of rightness, a face race neutrality, homogenization of the issue. That being said, this isn't permanently embedded in the American psyche, one, right? In other words, this present Supreme Court was constructed over time, right? The Federalist Society, of course, was born on the Yale Law School campus while I was there. Brett Kavanaugh was my, not only my classmate, right, but my small group mate. I spent a year with him in constitutional law. This was created, and that which is created can be destroyed, okay, number one. Number two, while they had baked this into the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court is running up against as you've alluded to, a demographic shift which is tectonic in nature, right? In other words, we are already majority minority. This room looks more like the United States than the Supreme Court looks like the United States, frankly, right? Literally, this room looks more like the America that most of our children see than the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is aberrational, right? Freakishly so.
So is the Senate.
All right, so is the Senate. Okay, so my point being to you, I think they're running up against a tectonic shift in terms of demography and also an impatience, right? In other words, I don't think this generation is going to buy this bill of goods. It flies in the face of what they're seeing. So in other words, yes, the Supreme Court bans abortion, okay? But when it's come up for a vote in the states, they lose consistently. Why? Because the Supreme Court, given the male tilt it has, beyond those marble steps, there's a nation of women who have something to say, okay? And so my point being to you here is, we need to be careful here that sometimes there's a certain kind of sophistry, a certain kind of intellectual sleight of hand on the Supreme Court that suggests that what we think, what we have announced, has always been the case and is perfectly supported by precedent. And in fact, it's not. We know the 14th Amendment has no such race-neutral history. We know the Brown versus Board of Education cannot be construed as some kind of race-neutral legal creation. My point to you is, in the same way that the Federal Society was created, we have to do the same thing. We have to literally create new institutions. We have to appoint more judges. We have to become smarter, more thoughtful, more strategic, and stop. And here's where my chronic optimism comes out, which is to say, I hate to say the realists who have every reason to be pessimistic will recite the facts and remind us that this has long been suggesting that it has forever been. And that's frankly just not the case. And so my point is, I'm a big believer in people's efforts. I'm a big believer in hard work. I'm a big believer, like literally, let's look around the world at what, in other words, I go back to the 1870s, my forebears, right, in the low country of South Carolina. Literally, they built their own schools. They freed themselves. My people were freed before the 14th Amendment, right? Harriet Tubman went to the low country of South Carolina and freed 700 slaves. My people were among them, right? So we were free before Abe Lincoln declared it as such, okay? My point being is, I think in our movements, we have to have much more intellectual confidence, much more movement confidence, get organized, and frankly, work harder. Right? It just stuns me. We like the Supreme Court is baked. No, the Federalist Society did its work. Why can't we do work? Right? Now, of course, I'm a former civil rights activist. This is what you would expect, but I think I'm right.
बहुजन क्रांति और बहुजन नायकों को समर्पित दलित दस्तक का 2024 का शानदार बहुजन कैलेंडर आ चुका है। कैलेंडर छोटे और बड़े दोनों साइजों में उपलब्ध है। बुकिंग के लिए दिए गए नंबर पर व्हाट्सएप करें या ईमेल करें। थोक में ऑर्डर करने पर मिलेगी आकर्षक छूट।